Don't eat that, sir. Abigail's voice sliced through the opera music. She came running from the edge of the shadows, her small sneakers skidding across the obsidian marble floor. Stop. Don't eat that. One hand gripped the hem of her denim dress so she would not fall. The other pointed straight at the plate in front of Kang-dae. Don't eat it, she said, breathless but certain. Please, sir, stop right now. That food has poison in it. You can't eat it. Kang-dae sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table. The bamboo chopsticks paused at his lips. On the plate before him was a serving of glazed wagyu beef under a dark soy reduction, the special dish his fiancée had proudly chosen for their engagement celebration. For one long second Kang-dae did not move. Across the room Mata, Abigail's mother, froze near the stone pillars. Abigail, Mata said, hurrying toward her daughter. Her voice was low, terrified, and full of apology before she even reached the table. Baby, come here right now. But Abigail did not move. She put something in it, Abigail said. Salvana rose slowly from the chair beside Kang-dae. She wore a silk gown, elegant and deep, with a diamond engagement ring flashing under the dragon chandelier. Until that moment she had looked like a woman stepping into the happiest night of her life. Now her smile tightened at the edges. Excuse me, Salvana said. Abigail pointed toward the preparation area. You went back there. You had a little white packet. You poured it into his sauce. A murmur passed through the men. It was meant to be a private dinner for the syndicate. No cameras, no outsiders, no enemies, just blood, brothers, loyalty, and wine. Salvana placed one hand against her chest as though the accusation itself had struck her. That is an ugly thing to say, she said, her voice still controlled but no longer sweet. Abigail, I don't know what you think you saw, but you do not run into a room full of soldiers and accuse me of poisoning my future husband. Mata reached Abigail and put both hands on her shoulders. Mr. Kang-dae, Miss Salvana, I am so sorry, Mata said. The heavy silence of the syndicate's grand hall was a physical weight, pressing down on the gathered soldiers and elite guests. Kang-dae looked from the tiny girl to his fiancée, his face a mask of iron that hid the storm brewing beneath the surface. He did not set the chopsticks down. He held them like a weapon, poised between life and a sudden violent end. Abigail did not shrink from his gaze. Her chest heaved, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with the desperate need to be heard. It was a white packet, Abigail said again, her voice ringing out against the cold marble walls. She thought I was playing with my doll near the pantry. She didn't see me. She opened her purse and took it out. It was a bitter powder. I saw it fall into the sauce like snow. Salvana gave a short, disbelieving laugh. She turned toward the guests, her eyes bright with a rehearsed kind of pity. A bitter powder? Snow? She repeated, her voice airy and light. Ethan, Kang-dae, surely we aren't listening to the imaginings of a child who has spent too much time watching cartoons in the kitchen. I'm not imagining. Abigail's voice broke, but she stepped closer to the table, her fingers steady as an arrow. It's in the sauce, under the meat. If you eat it, you won't wake up. A ripple of unease moved through the men standing at the perimeter. These were men who lived by the blade and the bullet, yet the sight of a child challenging the queen of their empire made their hands move toward their holsters. Kang-dae's eyes narrowed. He looked at the wagyu beef, the dark soy reduction shimmering under the light of the dragon chandelier. It looked perfect. It looked delicious. It looked like the love Salvana had promised him for 3 years. Mata's hands tightened on Abigail's shoulders, her face ashen. Please, sir, Mata whispered, her voice shaking with the knowledge of what happened to those who offended the boss. She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's saying. We will leave. We will leave right now. But Abigail would not be moved. She looked directly at Kang-dae, ignoring the looming soldiers and her mother's plea. She doesn't love you, sir, she said, the words falling like stones into deep water. She wants you to go away. Salvana's smile did not just tighten, it vanished. The elegance remained, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a coldness that matched the steel in Kang-dae's own heart. Enough of this, Salvana said, her voice dropping into a command. Mata, take your daughter out of this room before her stories cause a tragedy neither of you can afford. Kang-dae finally moved. He didn't look at Salvana. He looked at the plate. Then he looked at Abigail. A white packet? He asked, his voice a calm that terrified the room more than a shout ever could. Yes, sir, Abigail whispered. The bitter powder. The air in the grand hall turned to ice as two of Kang-dae's men stepped forward, their shadows stretching long across the floor. They did not speak, but the weight of their movement was enough to make Mata gasp, pulling Abigail back against her legs. With a swiftness that brooked no argument, the guards took Abigail and her mother by the arms. The grip was firm, meant to suppress, and the room watched in a suffocating silence as the girl who had dared to speak was separated from the man she had tried to save. Wait, Kang-dae said, his voice a low bell that silenced the scuffle before it could truly begin. He did not look at the guards. He did not look at Abigail. He was watching Salvana's hand. It was a small thing, nearly invisible to the guests who were still murmuring in shock. Salvana's fingers were resting on the edge of the tablecloth, clutching the fine linen as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. A fine rhythmic tremor was traveling through her knuckles, the diamond on her finger catching the light in a frantic, uneven rhythm. It was the only crack in her perfect armor. You're shaking, Salvana, Kang-dae said. It was not a question. Salvana's breath hitched, a small sound that seemed to echo in the vastness of the room. She forced a smile, though it did not reach the hard brightness of her eyes. I am shaken, Kang-dae. A child has just accused me of murder in front of our brothers. My heart is racing with the insult, not with guilt. She turned her gaze back to Abigail, her expression shifting into a mask of pity. Release them, Salvana said to the guards, trying to reclaim the authority of the room. They are clearly overwhelmed by the occasion. Mata, take the girl to the back and keep her there until we decide how to handle this breach of respect. But the guards did not move. They looked at Kang-dae, waiting for the only signal that mattered in this house. Kang-dae leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the trembling hand on the table. She said a white packet. He mused, the words slow and deliberate. She said a bitter powder. He picked up a small silver spoon and dipped it into the sauce, lifting a single drop toward the light. Salvana's hand tightened on the cloth until her nails went white. The hall was so quiet that the flickering of the candles seemed to make a noise like thunder. If the child is lying, Kang-dae said, his voice dropping into a tone that made the soldiers at the door straighten their backs, then she and her mother will pay for the disruption. But if she is telling the truth... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The tremor in Salvana's hand had reached her shoulder now, a secret vibration of terror that only he was close enough to see. The shadow of a man emerged from the hallway, his presence halting the panicked breath of the room. Dr. Han, the syndicate's private physician, stepped into the light of the dragon chandelier, holding a small glass vial containing a sample of the sauce. He did not look at the guests. His eyes were fixed on Kang-dae with a gravity that made the air grow thick and heavy. The child's eyes did not deceive her, sir, Dr. Han said, his voice a steady bell in the hollow silence. He held up the vial where a faint, milky residue had settled at the bottom. It is a rare, slow-acting toxin. It does not kill with a blow. It mimics the natural failure of the heart, building over hours until the pulse simply stops in your sleep. If you had finished that plate, you would not have seen the sunrise. A collective gasp broke from the guests, a wave of shock that crashed against the walls of the hall. Kang-dae did not move. He sat as still as a statue, his gaze shifting from the doctor to the woman standing frozen at his side. Salvana's face drained of color, the vibrant beauty she had worn like a mask turning into a sickly, translucent gray. The diamond on her hand caught the light one last time before she tucked her fingers into the folds of her silk gown. Kang-dae, she whispered, her voice a thin thread that threatened to snap. He is mistaken. He is part of some trick. Why would I do this? We are supposed to be happy. We are supposed to be one. But the words fell flat against the cold reality of the vial. Dr. Han stepped closer, his expression as hard as the obsidian floor. It is designed to be untraceable after the heart stops. A perfect accident for a man with many enemies and a high-stress life. It was not a seasoned seasoning, Miss Salvana. It was a sentence. Mata pulled Abigail closer, her hands shaking so hard they ruffled the girl's denim dress. Abigail watched the boss, her large eyes filled with a heavy, ancient sadness. She had seen the white packet, she had heard the secret clink of the spoon, and now the world was breaking apart because of it. Kang-dae finally stood, his chair scraping against the marble with a sound like a distant storm. He looked at Salvana, his eyes no longer searching for love, but for the truth he had been too blind to see. "You chose the dish," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the soldiers at the door reach for their weapons. "You chose the time. You chose the poison." The room held its breath. The dragon chandelier seemed to dim as the betrayal fully took root. Salvana did not look at him. She looked at the silver spoon still resting on the table, the small, shining witness to her undoing. The golden light of the dragon chandelier seemed to flicker and fail as a sudden, frantic motion broke the trance of the room. Salvana did not wait for the guards to close the distance. With a desperate shove that sent her heavy mahogany chair crashing against the floor, she turned and fled toward the service hallway. Her silk gown hissed against the marble, a silver blur that vanished into the darkness of the estate before the soldiers could draw their breath. "Find her." Kang-dae's voice exploded through the hall, a thunderclap that sent the men into a chaotic, disciplined surge. But the estate was a labyrinth of secret doors and ancient passages, and by the time the security team reached the rear gates, the night had swallowed her whole. She was gone, leaving behind only the scent of her expensive perfume and a vacuum of silence that felt like a secondary betrayal. Kang-dae stood at the head of the table, his hands curled into white-knuckled fists, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the woman he loved had sat moments before. He did not chase her. He turned instead toward his private study, his boots echoing with a heavy, hollow rhythm. "Benton," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, focused calm. "The safe. The files. Now." The study was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, but tonight it felt like a crime scene. Benton, the syndicate's most trusted advisor, was already there, his fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard of the primary terminal. He did not look up as Kang-dae entered. He simply pointed at a stack of papers spread across the desk, documents that had looked legitimate only yesterday. "It is worse than a simple poisoning, sir," Benton said, his voice tight with the weight of the discovery. "She did not just want your life. She wanted your name." He handed a folder to Kang-dae. Inside were land deeds, offshore transfer authorizations and power of attorney forms. They bore Kang-dae's signature, perfect and elegant, but as he ran his thumb over the ink, the truth became clear. The paper was too fresh. The stamps were off by a fraction of a millimeter. They were forgeries. A trail of paper ghosts designed to strip him of his restaurant empire and his syndicate holdings the moment his heart stopped beating. "She has been preparing this for years," Benton whispered. "Every dinner, every meeting, every night she spent by your side, she was studying your hand. She was building a cage for your legacy." Kang-dae looked at the forged signatures, the ink shining under the desk lamp like wet blood. He had built this world to be untouchable, but he had opened the gates for a woman who had used his own trust to dismantle it from within. Outside, the sirens of the search teams wailed into the night, but in the quiet of the study, the only sound was the rustle of the paper as Kang-dae realized the hunt had only just begun. The rain lashed against the tall windows of the study, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to count the seconds of the boss's rising fury. Kang-dae sat behind his desk, his face a landscape of cold stone, while Benton placed a single weathered folder in the center of the blotter. It was not a thick file, but it contained the weight of a decade of hatred. "Her name is not Salvana," Benton said, his voice as thin and dry as the paper he held. He slid a photograph across the desk. It was an old ID badge from the museum park, the edges yellowed by time and neglect. The face in the photo was younger, softer, but the eyes were unmistakable. "Her name is Han-na. She is the daughter of Min-hee, a woman who served your empire for 20 years before you tore it down to build your luxury towers." Kang-dae did not touch the photo. He looked at the name, Min-hee, and a flicker of a memory surfaced, a quiet woman who had worked the gift shop with a smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. "I remember her," he murmured, the words falling like ash. "You dismissed her without a week's notice," Benton continued, his tone devoid of judgment but heavy with the facts. "She was part of the older staff. You deemed a liability to the new image. When she lost the job, she lost everything. The stress triggered a collapse. She has been bedridden in a state-run facility for 7 years, her mind a maze of silence and the medications she can barely afford." He turned a page in the file, revealing a series of medical bills and eviction notices. Han-na watched her mother break. She watched the empire grow on the bones of her mother's health. "She didn't just find you, sir. He hunted you. She changed her name, her history, and her face to become the woman you would want to marry. She spent years learning to be your perfect mirror, all while waiting for the moment to take your heart. The dragon chandelier in the hall outside seemed to cast a long, twisted shadow into the room. Kang-dae looked at the forged signatures on his desk, then back at the ID badge of the woman he had discarded like a broken tool. He had called it a ruthless vision. He had called it progress. She wasn't looking for money, Kang-dae said, his voice dropping into a hollow register. No, Benton whispered. She wanted you to feel the sudden poverty of the soul. She wanted you to die in a bed as cold as the one her mother occupies. Outside, the storm intensified, the lightning illuminating the room with a harsh, unforgiving light. Kang-dae closed the folder, the click of the latch sounding like a final sentence. He had built a world of power and control, but he had ignored the wounds he left in the dark, and now those wounds had grown a name and a face that had nearly shared his bed. The weight of the doctor's words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, thicker than the cigar smoke that usually filled the boss's study. Kang-dae sat perfectly still, but his mind was racing, pulling at the threads of the last 6 months. He looked down at his hands, the hands that controlled an empire, and noticed the slight, nearly invisible tremor in his thumb. It was not just tonight, Kang-dae said, his voice a low bell that seemed to vibrate against the wood of his desk. He remembered the mornings in the spring when the sunlight had felt too bright, a pressure building behind his eyes that he had blamed on late-night negotiations. He remembered the sudden bouts of nausea after his morning coffee, the way his heart would gallop in his chest like a trapped animal while he sat in silence. He had told himself he was aging. He had told himself the weight of the syndicate was finally taking its toll. She has been feeding me this for months, he whispered, the realization falling like a blade. The tea she brought me every evening. The vitamins she insisted I take to keep my energy up. He was not caring for me. She was hollowing me out. Dr. Han nodded slowly, his expression full of a professional, heavy sadness. The toxin builds up in the fatty tissues, sir. It weakens the walls of the heart over time. If the child had not stopped you tonight, your body would have been too brittle to survive the final dose. She was preparing the soil for your grave long before she ever chose the sea base. Kang-dae leaned back, his eyes fixed on the dragon chandelier visible through the open door. Every gentle touch Salvana had given him, every worried look she had cast his way when he complained of a headache, it was all a calculation. She had watched him weaken with the same focus a gardener watches a flower bloom. She had held his hand while she waited for his pulse to fail. The betrayal was not a single act. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. I was her project, Kang-dae said, his voice dropping into a hollow register. Outside, the rain had turned to a steady, rhythmic drizzle, but the storm inside the study was only just beginning. He looked at the empty chair beside him where she used to sit, the ghost of her perfume still clinging to the leather. He had built a fortress to keep his enemies out, but he had invited the most patient killer of all to sit at his table and share his bed. Kang-dae stood up, the movement making his head swim for a brief, dizzying second. He gripped the edge of the desk until the wood bit into his palms. Benton, he said, his voice regaining its iron edge. Every bottle, every tea tin, every pill in this house. I want them tested. I want to know exactly how much of my life she has already stolen. The blue light from the monitors washed over Kang-dae's face, turning his skin into a mask of cold porcelain. He stood in the center of the dark surveillance room, his eyes fixed on a data stream that was hemorrhaging the secrets of his empire into the digital void. Every second that passed felt like a drop of blood leaving a wound that would not close. She didn't just want your heart to stop, sir, Benton said, his voice a low bell that seemed to echo against the humming servers. He tapped a key and a map of the city's shipping docks flickered onto the screen. Red zones began to blink across the territory, warehouses, transit routes, and secure drop points that only 3 people in the world were supposed to know. One of those people was now a shadow in the wind. She has opened the gates, Benton whispered. She has been sending encrypted bursts to the Cho Syndicate for the last 48 hours. The blueprints of your security, the schedules of your shipments, even the private codes for the harbor vaults. She didn't just plan a murder, she planned an invasion. Kang-dae's jaw tightened until the bone seemed to throb beneath his skin. The Cho Syndicate had been his blood rivals for 20 years, a pack of wolves waiting for a single sign of weakness to tear his world apart. Salvana Hana, had handed them the keys to his kingdom while she kissed his cheek and told him he looked tired. She sold the territory, Kang-dae said, his voice dropping into a hollow register that made the technicians at the desk stiffen. Yes, sir, Benton replied. The logs show she wasn't looking for a buyout. She wanted a total collapse. She ensured that even if you survived the toxin, you would wake up to find your streets occupied and your brothers dead. She didn't want a widow's inheritance. She wanted a scorched earth. Outside the window, the city lights looked like a sea of distant fire, beautiful and indifferent. Kang-dae looked at the blinking red zones on the map, realizing that the woman he had loved had spent every night of their engagement drawing a target on his back. She had traded his life's work to the men who hated him most, just to ensure that his fall would be absolute. She thinks I am already a dead man, Kang-dae said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. He turned away from the monitors, his movement a slow, heavy wave of iron. The betrayal had layers he was only beginning to uncover, a labyrinth of spite that reached into every corner of his life. He looked at the heavy steel door of the room, knowing that the Cho syndicate would be moving through the shadows at this very moment, fueled by the secret Salvana had poured into their laps like wine. Benton, he said, his tone regaining a cold, steady focus. Mobilize the sectors. If she has opened the gates, we will turn this city into a trap they never expected. The headlights of a black sedan cut through the rain-slicked street like twin blades, searching for the small house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Inside the modest living room, Mata clutched Abigail to her chest, the air in the small house feeling thin and cold as the shadow of a man moved across the front porch. The door did not creak. It exploded inward with a violence that shattered the quiet of the night. Where is the girl? A voice barked, the sound rough and full of a dark, hungry intent. Mata scrambled backward, her hands shielding Abigail's eyes as three men in heavy coats stepped over the threshold. These were not the boss's men. They wore the mark of the Cho syndicate, and their eyes held the cold emptiness of those who had come to silence a witness. They did not care for the age of the child or the innocence of the mother. They only cared that Abigail had seen the white packet, and they had been sent to ensure she never spoke of it again. Just as the lead man reached for Mata's arm, a roar of engines swallowed the sound of the rain. Two armored SUVs screeched to a halt on the lawn, the grass tearing under the weight of the tires. The front windows of the house shattered as Kang-dae's men, led by the silent and formidable Keller, swarmed through the openings. Back away from them. Keller's voice was a crack of thunder that halted the intruders mid-step. The small living room became a theater of steel and shadow. Mata pulled Abigail behind the sofa, the girl's sneakers scuffing against the carpet as they huddled in the dark. The sound of struggle was brief and brutal. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, the metallic click of restraints, and the sharp final commands of soldiers who were protecting their own. Within minutes, the Cho syndicate men were pinned to the floor, their faces pressed against the worn rug. Keller stepped over them, his gaze softening only when it reached the terrified girl. He knelt beside the sofa, his massive frame blocking the view of the violence. You're safe now, Abigail, he said, his voice a steady bell in the ringing silence. The boss sent us. He said no one touches the girl who told the truth. Mata's breath came in ragged, sobbing hitches as she leaned her head against the wall. She looked at the men in the black suits, realizing that her life had been pulled into a war she never wanted, but one she could no longer escape. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the tire tracks on the lawn, but inside, the reality had shifted. Kang-dae had not just saved his own life. He was now the only wall standing between Abigail and the world Salvana had unleashed. Keller stood up and signaled to his men. Move them out, he commanded. We're taking them to the estate. The city is no longer a place for this child. The heavy iron gates of the Whitmore estate swung shut with a sound like a distant cannon, sealing out the dangers of the city. The guest wing was a fortress of soft light and thick carpets, but as Mata and Abigail stepped into the grand hallway, the luxury felt as cold as the marble beneath their feet. Every corner was guarded by men in dark suits, their eyes alert and their hands never far from the heavy steel at their belts. You will be safe here, Kang-dae's voice came from the top of the stairs, a low bell that made the shadows in the room seem to retreat. He descended the staircase slowly, his face still a mask of stone, but his eyes softened when they landed on Abigail. She was still clutching her doll, the pink dress of the toy dusty from the chaos of the night. He stopped a few feet away, his massive frame blocking the view of the armed men at the door. He looked at Mata, who was trembling in her denim jacket, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "My home has become a battlefield," Kang-dae said, his voice dropping into a hollow register. "But I will not allow it to swallow you. This wing is isolated. The windows are reinforced. No one enters without my personal code." Mata swallowed hard, her gaze moving from the elegant chandeliers to the high-tech sensors blinking near the ceiling. "We don't belong here, Mr. Kang-dae. We are just ordinary people caught in a world we don't understand." "You are the people who saved me," Kang-dae replied, his tone as firm as the iron gates outside. "That makes you my responsibility. Salvana Hana knows that Abigail is the only one who saw her face in the dark. To her this child is a loose thread. To me she is the truth." Abigail stepped forward, her small sneakers making a soft scuffing sound against the carpet. She looked up at the boss, her eyes large and filled with an ancient, quiet wisdom. "Is the bad lady coming here?" Kang-dae knelt down so he was level with her eyes, a movement that made the soldiers at the perimeter hold their breath. "She will try," he said, his voice a steady promise. "But she will have to move through me. And I am not a man who loses twice." He stood and signaled to Mrs. Helen, the estate manager who was waiting in the shadows of the doorway. "See to their needs. Anything they ask for, they receive." As Abigail and Mata were led down the hall, the quiet of the guest wing settled over them, but it was a waiting quiet. Kang-dae stood in the center of the hall, his shadow stretching long toward the heavy doors. He had brought the witness into his sanctuary, turning his home into a cage and a shield all at once. Outside, the night was full of wolves, but inside, the girl who told the truth was finally behind walls that would not break. The quiet of the guest wing was broken by a sudden sharp intake of breath as Abigail sat upright on the silk duvet. She looked at the heavy oak door, her eyes wide as the memory of a week ago surfaced like a buoy in dark water. Mata reached for her, her hand gentle on the girl's shoulder, but Abigail was already looking toward the intercom on the wall. "I remember something," Abigail whispered, her voice a small but steady bell in the hollow room. Minutes later, Kang-dae stood by the window of the guest suite, his massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight. He turned slowly as Abigail spoke, her hands moving through the air to describe a night he had forgotten. It was the night they had toured the new restaurant, the crown jewel of his empire, before the grand opening. He had been talking to investors, his back turned to the kitchen prep area. "She thought I was playing hide and seek," Abigail said, her sneakers scuffing against the plush carpet. She went to the back where the air vent is high on the wall. He had a little black book. It was thin with a gold tie around it. She stood on a crate and pushed it deep into the metal slats. She looked around to see if anyone saw. She didn't look happy, sir. She looked like she was burying a secret. Kang-dae's jaw tightened until the bone seemed to throb beneath his skin. That restaurant was the heart of his financial network. Salvana Hana had hidden a ledger there. It was more than just a diary. It was the map of his destruction. "Benton," Kang-dae said into his collar mic, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "The Dragon's Reach location. The kitchen vents. I want a team there in 10 minutes. I want that vent dismantled." Benton's voice came through the comms, tight with the weight of the task. "The Cho Syndicate has eyes on that sector, sir. It is a risk to move now." "I do not care about the risk," Kang-dae replied, his gaze shifting to the small girl who had once again handed him the key to his own house. "She has been hiding the evidence of her forged transfers right under my nose. If that book holds the offshore codes, we can cut her off before she finishes the liquidation." Abigail watched him, her large eyes filled with a quiet, ancient sadness. She had seen the white packet, she had seen the black book, and now she was watching the man she saved prepare for war. Kang-dae walked toward her and stopped, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You have a gift for seeing what others want to hide, Abigail," he said, his tone as firm as the iron gates outside. He turned toward the door, his movement a slow, heavy wave of iron. The hunt for the truth had moved from the hospital to the shadows of his own empire, and as the sirens of the search teams wailed in the distance, Kang-dae knew that the little black book was the only thing that could end the night. The heavy scent of damp concrete and antiseptic rose to meet Kang-dae as he stepped into the dim hallway of the tenement building. The walls were peeling, a map of neglect that led to the very end of the corridor, where a single yellow light flickered like a dying star. He did not wait for his men to clear the way. He pushed open the door to apartment 4B, the wood groaning on hinges that had long since surrendered to the rust. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the rhythmic, shallow breathing of someone close to the end. Salvana Hana was not standing. She was kneeling by a narrow cot, her silk engagement gown now torn and stained, the fabric looking like a discarded bandage in the gray light of the room. On the cot lay an elderly woman, her face a translucent mask of silver hair and hollow skin. This was Min-hee, the worker Kang-dae had discarded, now a ghost waiting for the final departure. "You found us," Salvana said, her voice a thin thread that did not shake. She did not look up as Kang-dae's shadow fell over her. She continued to stroke her mother's hand, her fingers moving with a desperate ancient tenderness. Kang-dae stood at the foot of the bed, his massive frame making the small room feel like a cage. He looked at the woman he had once called his future, seeing the raw, bleeding grief that had fueled her every kiss and every lie. "The black book was where the child said it would be," Kang-dae said, his voice a low bell that seemed to vibrate against the thin walls. "The Cho Syndicate is retreating. Your plan is over, Hana." Salvana finally lifted her eyes. They were bright with a hard, cold fire, but her face was wet with tears she had no strength to hide. "The plan was over the moment I looked into your eyes and saw that you didn't even remember her name," she whispered. "You built an empire on the silence of people like my mother. I didn't just want your money. I wanted you to see the room where your vision ends." Kang-dae looked from the dying woman to the ledger in his hand, the leather cool and heavy against his palm. He had come here to end a threat, but he was standing in the wreckage of a life he had dismantled years ago without a second thought. "She is cold," Salvana said, her voice dropping into a hollow register. "She has been cold for 7 years because of you." The dragon chandelier of his estate seemed a world away from this place of salt and shadows. Kang-dae did not move. He did not call for his men. He stood in the silence of the room, the weight of the betrayal finally eclipsed by the crushing reality of the cost. Outside, the city hummed with a life that did not care, but inside apartment 4B, the only sound was the slow, laboring pulse of a woman who had become the conscience he never wanted to find. The shadows of the tenement room seemed to lengthen, pulling the cold of the hallway into the narrow space between the boss and the woman who had tried to end him. Kang-dae stood motionless, the weight of the silver-handled chopsticks he had held hours ago now replaced by the crushing gravity of a memory he had long since buried. He looked at the peeling wallpaper, then at the face of the woman who had shared his bed and his secrets. "You call it a vision, sir," Salvana whispered, her voice a thin thread that did not shake. She stood up slowly, her silk gown rustling like dead leaves against the grime of the floor. She did not look at the guns held by the men in the hallway, she looked only at Kang-dae. "You called it a restaurant empire. You called it a luxury destination. But to my mother it was the only world she had. She had worked that park since the day it opened. She knew every stone, every tree, every child who walked through those gates." She stepped closer, her eyes bright with a hard, cold fire. "When you bought it, you didn't see the people. You saw aging assets. You saw redundant overhead. You signed a paper in a climate-controlled office and wiped away 20 years of her life in a single afternoon. No pension. No thank you. Just a security guard escorting her to the gate with a box of her things." Kang-dae's jaw tightened until the bone seemed to throb beneath his skin. He remembered the reports. He remembered the efficiency experts. He had called it a ruthless vision to his investors, a necessary cleansing to ensure the highest standards of excellence. "She didn't just lose a job," Salvana continued, her voice dropping into a hollow register. "She lost her purpose. She sat in our kitchen for 3 days and didn't speak. Then she collapsed. The doctors said it was the stress, a sudden failure of the spirit that the body couldn't follow. She has been in this bed in this dark because you wanted a dragon chandelier instead of a museum park." She gestured toward the dying woman on the cot, her hand trembling with the weight of the history she had carried. "I didn't hate you because you were a mafia boss, Kang-dae. I hated you because you were a man who didn't think the people beneath him had hearts that could break. I wanted you to eat the poison so you would die the same way she is, slowly, quietly, and completely alone." Silence fell like a blade. The hum of the city outside seemed to fade, leaving only the laboring breath of Min-hee. Kang-dae looked at the ledger in his hand, then at the woman who had turned her entire life into a weapon of justice. He had built a world of power and control, but he had ignored the human cost of his progress, and now the bill had finally come due in a room that smelled of dust and old tears. The glass of the front window did not just break. It vanished into a cloud of diamonds as a spray of gunfire erupted from the street. The heavy rhythmic thumping of high-caliber rounds chewed into the peeling walls of the tenement, turning the small room into a storm of plaster and dust. The Cho syndicate had not waited for the conversation to end. They had come to collect the debt Salvana had promised them, and they intended to leave no one alive to tell the story. Down. Get down. Kang-dae's voice was a roar that cut through the mechanical scream of the rifles. He didn't move like a man who had been poisoned. He moved like the giant he was, lunging across the small space to shield the cot where Min-hee lay. He threw his massive frame over Salvana, pinning her to the floor as a second volley of lead shredded the headboard above them. He could feel the heat of the air as the bullets passed, a chaotic dance of death that didn't care for the sick or the vengeful. Outside, the screech of tires and the shouting of his own men signaled that the perimeter had been breached. Keller's voice came through the comms, a steady bell in the middle of the madness. "Sir, they're coming through the rear fire escape. We are pinned down in the alley." Kang-dae reached into the small of his back and pulled a heavy steel pistol from his belt. He didn't look at the door. He looked at Salvana, her face white with a terror that finally eclipsed her hatred. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "If you move, you die." A shadow darkened the doorway, a man in a long coat with a submachine gun leveled at the bed. Kang-dae did not hesitate. He fired twice, the sound of the shots like thunderclaps in the small room. The intruder fell back into the hallway, but more footsteps were echoing on the stairs. The Cho syndicate was pouring into the building like a flood, fueled by the secret Salvana had poured into their laps. Kang-dae grabbed a heavy wooden dresser and shoved it toward the door with a strength born of pure, focused intent. He turned back to the cot, seeing Min-hee's eyes open, wide and glazed with the confusion of a woman who had spent years in the dark and was now waking up to a war. "You have to get them out," Salvana whispered, her voice a thin thread of silk and salt. "I am getting all of you out," Kang-dae replied, his gaze shifting to the window where his extraction team was finally visible through the smoke. He had spent his life destroying things to build his vision, but in this small, crumbling room his only vision was survival. He gripped the edge of the cot, ready to move the woman he had once discarded, while the world he had built burned in the street below. The morning light washed over the estate with a quiet, hollow brightness that did not match the ruins of the week before. Kang-dae stood in the grand hallway, his massive frame silhouetted against the open doors of the guest wing. He did not look like the man who had sat at the head of the mahogany table. He looked like a man who had walked through a fire and found himself standing on the other side, unsure of the air he was breathing. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice a low bell that made the shadows in the corridor retreat. Abigail stood by the marble pillars, her small suitcase at her feet and her doll tucked firmly under her arm. She looked up at him, her large eyes filled with that same steady, ancient wisdom that had saved his life. "My mama says we have to go back to our house now," she said, her sneakers scuffing softly against the floor. "But she says thank you for the guards." Kang-dae stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the obsidian marble. He did not call for Benton. He did not call for his soldiers. He looked at the girl who had become his conscience in the dark. "I have made many mistakes, Abigail," he said, his voice dropping into a hollow register. "I thought power was about what you could take. I didn't know it was about what you choose to repair." He had not sent Salvana to the dark cells of the syndicate. Instead, he had moved her and Min-hee to a private care facility, the best the city could offer, with doctors who did not ask about names or histories. He had spent the dawn hours signing a different kind of paper, not land deeds or forgeries, but the charter for the Whitmore Hahn Foundation. It was a promise to every worker he had discarded, a bridge built back to the people he had considered redundant overhead. "Is the bad lady still sad?" Abigail asked, her voice small but clear in the vastness of the hall. "She is," Kang-dae replied, his gaze shifting toward the high iron gates. "But she is not alone. And neither are you." He reached into his pocket and handed a small gold card to Mata, who was waiting near the car. "This is not a gift," he said, his tone as firm as the stone pillars behind them. "It is a debt." Abigail told the truth when the world was silent. If she ever needs anything, if she ever sees something the world tries to hide again, you call me. Mata nodded, her eyes wet with a relief she couldn't name. As the car pulled away, Abigail waved from the window, a small hand against the glass. Kang-dae stood on the steps of his empire, watching the tail lights vanish into the city. He had built a world of control, but he was finally beginning to understand that the real vision was not in the heights of the towers, but in the hands he chose to hold up. He turned back toward the house, the silence of the estate finally sounding like a place worth returning to. The story concludes that while betrayal often hides behind the mask of trust, justice prevails when we protect the innocent and pursue a truth that seeks to heal rather than just to hurt. If you enjoy this kind of story, please like, subscribe and show your support.